All right, so this week for our first PowerPoint presentation, we're going to talk about Kiev and Rus um, and the movement east. I'm just going to introduce kind of real quickly in the first slide kind of what we're going to be covering throughout class, and then we'll talk about a little bit about the geography of Russia because you can't talk about Russia without mentioning geography because it's so huge and it's so vast and there's so many different types of climates and mountains and rivers and lakes, and all of these are important to the idea of what Russia is, much like it is important to the idea of what Alaska is. Then we'll talk about the early encounters of Russians with peoples of the East, especially the Mongols. We'll talk about post-Genghis Khan Mongolia and a little bit of what their effect was on the Russians. Mostly I'm going to leave that to you reading your book, but I still want to discuss some things. Then we're going to talk about the Drang nach Osten of Ivan IV, also known as the Terrible and the Dread. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the players that were key to the early movement east of the Russians. So just a little introduction. When you're dealing with the Russian territorial expansion, you encounter words, superlatives like the greatest expanse of steppe in the world, the most extensive coniferous forest in the world, longest coastline in the world, coldest climates in the northern hemisphere, etc., etc. And it truly is one of the largest empires in history. Under the late Russian Empire into the Soviets, it was the largest country in the world, and it held dominion over more than 40% of what we would consider to be Eurasia. So this is a large amount of land. So real quickly, I just want to introduce some early terms for you. We're going to discuss the early Rus, which would be people who moved into the east from the west. They had moved to the west into Europe, but their most intense and expansive efforts were to the east. And as we go through class, chronologically as much as possible, while the U.S. was budding under Manifest Destiny in the 1800s, right, the movement west, the Muscovites were traversing a much larger and even more inhospitable land as they were moving east into Siberia. And as we will see throughout the class, the Rus people will come to not unquestioningly dominate the area like most of Manifest Destiny as the Americans moved west and kind of tamed the West. But we will see that they do have a very large presence in Siberia today, and a lot of this starts with Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Third, and Ivan the Fourth. At the same time, they will suffer humiliation underneath the yoke of the Mongols, which we will talk about, and the Golden Horde. But out of those ashes will rise a succession of astute great princes of Muscovy that will succeed in the territorial expansion of the Russian Empire. Particularly effective will be Ivan III in the late 15th century, and he will consolidate a semblance of power and create a solidified Muscovy that will be added onto by his successors, including Ivan the Great, or the Terrible, or the Dread, depending on how he treated you. It was late in Ivan's rule, or Ivan, that the first major step was taken to conquer Siberia. And so by 1639, only 57 years later, after Ivan III moves east, the Russians, with the help of the Cossacks, which we will discuss, were standing on the shores of the Sea of Okhotsk. Right? They were all the way to the east. Then it was Peter the Great who transformed himself from the Tsar of just Muscovy into the quote-unquote Emperor of Russia. He not only pushed the empire to the shores of the Baltics, but he also thrusted eastward towards China, Kamchatka, and he also sent Bering to look for a northern passage. And we all know from our Alaskan history how that turned out. And so for the next 150 years after Peter the Great, the value of the East for Russia grew exponentially. Okay, this is an important part of the Russian Empire. And so when it becomes important and as modernity moves forward, something we'll be talking about quite frequently in a great book that you will read on, is the creation of the Trans-Siberian Railway. This would lead to relations with other peoples throughout the East, including Manchuria and the Japanese and the Chinese, that will eventually lead to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was still at its apex, but it was crumbling from inefficiency. And by 1905, as we'll look at later in class, it began to be blocked no more by the Germans, by the Japanese, and by the British in Central Asia. Okay, so it was at this time period, after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, that the world wars come into effect, and the might of the Russian army during World War I was not only shown to be suspect, but that the autocracy, the corruption, and the centralization of Tsardom was too much to handle. And as we know, in 1917, which we'll discuss further, the Bolsheviks revolt, and by 2021, they win the Russian Civil War, and the Soviet Union is created. Now, when World War II occurs, the might of Joseph Stalin was shown during the invasion of Russia by the Wehrmacht, or the German army, and the subsequent defeat of them at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943 essentially began the decline of the Nazi Empire. It was not for 2 years until the Nazis finally gave up, but the Battle of Stalingrad was the deciding factor in World War II. However, there was much fighting in the East as well, and we'll talk a lot about what's going on in East Asia and East Russia during these wars, as opposed to what's kind of happening on the Western Front. But it is important to understand that not only Hitler, but Napoleon before him and many of the kings of Sweden before them invaded Russia, only to find that when you invade Russia, that is the death knell of your army. The only people who understood that were the Mongols, believe it or not. And as World War II ends and China becomes communist, then you get a tenuous relation with China starting in the 1950s between China and the Soviet Union, which is quite interesting because both were communist countries, but they were different types of communism, and we'll really discuss the relationship between the Chinese and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This is also when the Soviets really begin to move into Siberia, not only with their advanced technology, but they also used prison labor to help pacify the regions in what would become known as gulags, and we'll discuss those at length, using slave labor to tame a wilderness. And in a lot of ways, they did a good job of it. Lastly, at the end of the class, we will talk about the dissolution of the Soviet Union into today. And that's the last book that you will be reading. And then there are many questions that the Russians had to deal with that Alaskans have become familiar with today. What is the role of the government in these vast lands? How do they extract all the natural resources from the harsh environment? Who owns the land? How do you keep some of these resources renewable, especially fish? Fish are just as important to the Russian Empire in the East as fishing is to Alaska into today. Who gets the money? Who's taxed? So on and so forth. And so these are all questions that Alaskans deal with today, and it's the same type of questions that the Russian Federation deals with in the eastern lands into today. So all of these things, this was just a quick introduction, we will be covering in class. And we'll begin this week, like I said, with a discussion of the geography, early meetings with Asia and Asians, specifically the Mongols. And then we will end with Ivan the Terrible's beginning push into the East and what that deals with. So let's talk a little bit about the geography, and I hope you can see this map fairly well, and I'll kind of point out what I'm talking about while we discuss it. Um, so really, it is Russia is a northern country with northern people and geography. It is actually the closest neighbor to America besides Canada and Mexico. There are, in some places, only 2.5 miles separate us between the islands of the Big Diomede, which is in Russia, and Little Diomede, which is in America, and these are in the Bering Strait. Um, Interestingly enough, the Nile is not the only great river that flows north, but also in Russia, and we'll discuss them more thoroughly, is the Ob and the Irtysh, the Yenisei, and the Lena. They all go from south to north and empty into the Arctic Ocean. Um, Russia extends 170 degrees of latitude, meaning west to east, and it covers almost halfway around the world. That latitude does. It also covers 11 time zones, right? It is enormous. So into today, Russians really discuss how they can change the time zone, because when things are happening in Moscow, everybody in the East is already asleep, right? And so business, communications, things like that, there are a difference of 8, 9, 10, 11 hours between the West and the East, which is just too much to handle. It really is a transitional area, because as one moves eastward, you can actually see the transition from Europe into Asia. I've had the chance to go there, and hopefully I'll get some pictures. I just got to find them. When you're in St. Petersburg in the West, you're in Europe, no question about it. But when you're in Moscow, which isn't that far from St. Petersburg, you kind of realize that you're not in the West anymore. You're kind of more in the central east part of Asia. And then as you move south and east from there, you're definitely not in the West. And peoples begin to change into Mongolic looking people. Villages change, modernity changes, technology changes, and it really is a transition from the West to the East. And the real imaginary yet real line between the West and the East is this little area right here called the Ural Mountains. There is no difference between people on the west side and the east side right next to each other, but it's kind of like a divide all the way down between the west and the east. So you get West Siberia into West Siberia when you're on the other side of the Ural Mountains. And so this is what we are going to call, this area right in here is what we are going to call Asiatic Russia. And it's divided into 3 regions. You have West Siberia, which is the Ural Mountains to the Yenisei River, which is right here. This is basically Western Siberia. It's 800,000 square miles of low-lying plains. There's a lot of marshes, and underneath all of this is an enormous amount of oil and gas. Then you have East Siberia, which is right here, and it covers east of the Yenisei River to the Lena River, which is right here. The Lena River basically starts in Lake Baikal and moves north into the Laptev Sea into the Arctic Ocean. This is mostly plateau from this area right here, and we'll discuss a little more about it. And lastly, what is known as the Far East, which is this vicinity right here. And this is usually preceded by Russia or the Soviet Union. So it's either called the Russian Far East or the Soviet Far East in this vicinity right here. It's 2 million square miles with a wide variety of terrain, and the range of climates throughout this whole area right here. You can also divide the Far East into regions such as the tundra, stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Arctic Circle, this vicinity right here, excuse me, with no trees but moss and lichen. In the summer, it melts into something that's called muskeg, which is very hard to traverse. There are enormous mosquitoes here, and there are kernels of population centers here, but mostly it is untouched. To the south is what is called the taiga, and it's the world's greatest coniferous forest in this vicinity right here. Um, Here there's scattered tribes of people and some of the world's most valuable fur animals. And the reason why they're so valuable is it's so cold up there. So their fur, like sea otter fur in Alaska, is very fine and very soft, and people want it. We're talking about sable Arctic cats, which are still the biggest cats in the world. There probably aren't that many left. I don't know the exact amount, but all of their furs are quite valuable, and this is one reason for the push into the east that we'll talk about. To the south, then, in this vicinity here, what we would call probably Mongolia today, and some of the Central Asian country, the stands. In this vicinity right here is the steppe, and it's the world's most extensive grassland. And for millennia, this has been the area that's home for nomadic peoples. And since the taiga and the tundra are not great for grazing or moving, the steppe has really been Eurasia's gateway for centuries from the east to the west. This is where the Mongols lived. This is where the Huns lived. This is where all of these nomadic peoples who moved south into China and west into the Caucasus Mountains, into Persia, into Europe, they all originate in this vicinity right here. And then so there's also this idea that a lot of these places are going to be dubbed what is called Siberia. We just call it Siberia. And this is also kind of what we talk about when we talk about Asiatic Russia. Siberia have the lowest temperatures ever recorded in the northern hemisphere, which has been found on the Lena River here at minus 95 degrees Fahrenheit. People who live here have windows that are triple paned, not double paned, and work and school usually goes on until they reach a point of minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is really, some of you probably haven't experienced this while living in Alaska. This is when machinery tends to stop working and becomes brittle. This is also at minus 50 degrees is when you spit, it'll freeze and it'll bounce off the ground before it gets there. 40% of the Siberia is covered in permafrost, which we know about, which makes construction expensive and hard. And in the summer, it can get quite hot and humid in this area. And so this stuff melts and it's impossible to move through. There have been known to have changes of 75 degrees in the weather in 5 to 6 hours. So this is a vast, difficult, tough place to live. Excuse me. There are also some mountain ranges that are important to the beginning of the movement east and to the peoples, and we'll talk a little bit about them. I just kind of want to show you where they are. So here are the Ural Mountains, kind of dividing the west and the east of Russia. You get the Pamir Mountains down here, which kind of creates this little shelter between Afghanistan and what we would consider Mongolia today and into China. Then you have a much larger mountain range called the Tian Shan Mountains right here that really is the difference between the Persian Empire and Indo-European speaking peoples and the West Siberian, East Siberian, Mongolic, and Altaic language speaking people, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And you also have the Altai Mountains here, which is even a much bigger boundary. And if you move to the east here, there are two important mountain ranges for Russia's sake, and they are called the Yablonov Mountains and the Stanovoy Mountains. And these kind of separate much of what we consider to be East Siberia with northern China. Also importantly is the islands of the Far East, and the largest one is called Sakhalin, which is right here just north of Japan. And it runs 500 miles along the coast of Asia, while coming close to the mouth of the Amur River, which we will talk about. It is also entwined with this island are the Kuril Islands, which are in this vicinity right in here, off of the Kamchatka Peninsula in this area here. The Kurils are from the southern tip of Kamchatka to the northeast corner of Hokkaido. So this is Japan right here, but this is Russia right here. And there are over 600 miles that form a barrier between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific Ocean. Here are some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, but they are a mariner's nightmare. Kind of like the Aleutians, they're shrouded in mist. And the only thing that the Kuril Mountains are good for as far as empire is concerned is what they can take out of the ocean. There are nothing on these islands except some of the best fishing in the world. So there have been throughout history a lot of difference of opinion as to who owns these Kuril Mountains, or excuse me, Kuril Islands, and who can fish there and why. Along with these islands, you have the Sakhalin Island, you also, and the Kurils, you have rivers. And the first river that helps define part of West Siberia is the Ob and the Irtysh River. And it doesn't show on this map, but they actually do meet in the Altai Mountains. And the Ob moves from south to north into the Kara Sea, into the Arctic Ocean. These two rivers are similar to the Mississippi and the Missouri in that one great river, the Irtysh is huge, is also a tributary to the Ob River. So a lot of the places in here, these small streams from the Irtysh feed into the Ob to make a larger river. The Irtysh rises in the Altai Mountains and flows north and west, gathering outputs from the Urals, and it meets the Ob about 600 miles before the Ob enters this huge, huge estuary right here into the Arctic Ocean. Next, you get the Yenisei River, which is right here, which, as you can see, is extremely straight, surprisingly straight, and that also flows from the south to the north. This starts in Mongolia, in here, roughly 200 miles west of Lake Baikal. I don't know if you can see it, but it comes in here. This is the Yenisei River. It's a remarkably straight line, and this is also another barrier that people had to cross as they're moving east. And like I said, these are not small rivers. These are Yukon, Nile, Mississippi type sized rivers that are cold in the summer, it's hot, or excuse me, cold in the winter, it's hot in the summer, and these are hard to traverse, especially when things are melting. They become huge. Your next river is called the Lena River, which is in here. And this kind of separates East Siberia from the Russian Far East. It's near Lake Baikal. Right here is where it starts. Excuse me. And it also gets tributaries from the Yablanovo and the Stanovoy Mountains. It has a principal city on it called Yakutsk, which we'll talk about, which becomes a very important trading post for the Russians later. And this is roughly where it gets colder than anywhere else in Russia, which basically means coldest in the northern hemisphere is in this vicinity right here, because there's a small mountain range here as well. And lastly, you get one river that goes west to east, and this one is called the Amur River right here. And this is an important river because it divides China from Russia. And this is also a large river. This one goes east to west, and it's also called Heilongjiang in Chinese, which means Black Dragon River. It serves as the Russo-Sino border, and this is a large stepping stone between Russia and China. And we'll discuss throughout modern history, especially, there's been, incursions through from both sides. Perhaps most importantly, when we're dealing with the Russian Far East, and the Siberia is the resources of them all, the natural resources. This is a treasure house of riches. It contains 90% of all of Russia's resources. Timber supply beyond anything compared anywhere else in the world. Oil, gas, minerals like gold, ore, and virtually any other metal that humans use for consumption are located in some part of the Far East, including graphite and coal. The second most profitable diamond mine field in the world is near Yakutia in East Siberia. And not to mention, since these rivers are so huge, they have some of the largest hydroelectric facilities in the world. So not only are they digging the earth for energy, they're creating energy in vast amounts on these large rivers. Um, and bottom line is fish are very important, especially in the way far east, just like in Alaska. And so we will be discussing that as well. Now, as far as the peoples are concerned, there is an extraordinary variety of people. In the West, you have Slavic languages in the West, and Indo-European, which would be considered English is an Indo-European language in the south and the east of the Urals. So in this vicinity right here, they came from Persia up through Afghanistan in this vicinity right here. So you have Slavic languages in this vicinity, Indo-European, and well, when it becomes the Russian Empire, Russian as well. But before the Russian Empire, we're talking about the indigenous. You had Indo-European languages down here. But most of the people speak, before the Russian Empire, what is called the Finno-Ugric or Altaic languages. And that's in this vicinity right here. The three main groupings of these languages, of the Altaic languages, are Mongolic, Turkic, and Tungusic. Turkic is spoken in the Central Asian countries here, and into Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, which we will discuss later, but in this vicinity right here. A subgroup of Turkic is called Yakut, which is spoken by inhabitants of the quote-unquote freezing unit or icebox of Siberia, which is up in here. Hence, it will soon be called Yakutia. And it actually, in the middle of eastern Siberia and in the north and the east here, this will actually be called Yakutia, which is over 1 million square miles and will become the largest autonomous republic in the Russian Federation, which we will talk about later. But the bottom line is if Yakutia were a country today, it would be the 8th largest country in the world. So we are talking about a large amount of land here. And the Mongolic languages are located in two spots. The Kalmuks, which are just west of the lower Volga River, and the Buryats, those west, south, and east of Lake Baikal in this vicinity right here. They would be speaking Buryat, a Buryat language, which is a form of a Mongolic language. The Tungusic are small and scattered through the east. There's little pockets of people who speak Tungusic dialects throughout the east and mostly in this vicinity here. So it is this vastness and this geography that the peoples of the West would come to meet the people of the East. And this is just a little background because, like I said, we can't discuss Russia, and we definitely cannot discuss the Russian East if we don't talk about rivers, islands, mountains, resources, and peoples. So all of this entwined is what we would consider to be called Asiatic Russia. Now, let's get to the early encounters. By the 9th century, there was an Eastern Slavic people who were fighting people from the West, and they were fighting people from the North as well. And at the same time, if you remember that map, we're talking about west of the Ural Mountains at this time period. You're also getting a parade of migrants from the eastern section of the steppes into the west looking for food. and grazing land for their animals. And we're talking about people like the Huns, they're called Avars, there's Khazars, there's Magyars, and so forth. But the people who come to dominate Western Europe and create a semblance of a centralized government will be the Vikings. And they will be coming in from Scandinavia, across Finland, from Sweden, Denmark, across Finland into the northwestern part of what we would consider to be Russia today. Um, and it is really one of the great Viking surges in the late ninth century that would forever change the political environment of the Russian Empire. They're known in history as Varangians, and what these Scandinavians did is they built these light, big boats that they could carry over land and then row upstream easily. And they would thrust up these rivers that emptied into the Baltic, and they would go through what we would consider to be Moscow today, down through the Volga River, into the Caspian Sea, and the Dnieper River into the Black Sea. And the most legendary of these Vikings, especially for Russia's sake, was King Rurik. And here is a picture of Rurik, of a Rurik statue today that still stands in the town of Novgorod, which he found, which Novgorod will just be southeast of what we would call Moscow today. And Novgorod will be the first real Western type city in the Russian, what we would consider to be the Russian Empire today. He's the legendary leader of these people, and these people called themselves the Rus. He establishes Novgorod as a base in 1862, and within a decade, he had moved through to Kiev, which is west. Kiev is now the capital of Ukraine, and proved to be a very efficient general. And Novgorod and Kiev become these bases for trade and defense against migrants from the steppes. Rurik's grandson, Sviatoslav, was also a great leader, and I want you to look at the difference between the names. So Rurik is a Viking. His grandson is named Sviatoslav. So Sviatoslav is proof that within 2 generations, the Vikings had lost their Scandinavian identity and language, and it had become a synthesis of this Viking Slavic mix of people. And these people would be known as, would come to create what is known as Kievan Russia, which means that they had their base out of Kiev and their base out of Novgorod, and they carved this little piece of land in what we would call Northwest Russia today for themselves. It would become a loose federation of city-states, each having their own prince, and the prince of Kiev known as the primus inter pares, or the first among equals. And he would soon become called the Great Prince. So he's kind of the prince of princes. Moving quickly through this history, then you get Vladimir in 988, and he is called Vladimir the Great because he was a great prince of Kiev, and he is the man that opted in favor of Christianity over other religions for the Kievan Rus. Here's how the story is supposed to go. Vladimir sent emissaries to the Islamic empires in Persia, the Jewish people who lived in those empires, and then the head of the Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, in Byzantium, which we would call Constantinople back then. We call it Istanbul today. His emissaries came back, and he was convinced that Orthodox Byzantium in Constantinople was where people, quote unquote, lived a godly life. And so Vladimir converts all of the people around him and oversees all of their baptisms into the Eastern Orthodox Church of Christianity. And that is what what is the Russian Orthodox Church into today. And as a result of this would come, instead of thinking about Judaism or Islam or even Western Christianity, because there's a Western Roman Christian empire at this time period, the Russians choose to have an Asian concept of Christianity and Orthodoxy. And what comes out of this is the idea of Caesaropapism, meaning that the leader, the great prince, not only was the arbiter of temporal affairs, or affairs of the state, of worldly affairs, the day-to-day running of business, but he was also the arbiter of spiritual affairs, right? So not only is he the secular leader, but he is also the religious leader, and we will see that that will turn into what is called a czar. So he is Caesar, but he is also the Pope, right? And so Vladimir creates this all-powerful being, which we will see Russian look into today. I would consider Vladimir Putin to be one of these men today. He was a leader who knew how to exercise power, as did his son Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav used centralization, he used language, and he used religion as a unifier, oftentimes forced, to create this very centralized Kievan Rus, right? And when you can connect people with language and you connect people with religion, then you can connect them with government, and that is how you centralize and bring people together. However, unfortunately for Yaroslav, and oh, by the way, these are all descendants of Rurik at this time period. However, Yaroslav's successors, it becomes thoroughly muddled, and it was soon hard to tell which prince was a descendant of Rurik and which prince was not, and this also becomes exacerbated by the Mongol advance into the region by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century. Now, I don't want to discuss too much about the Mongols, as you are reading a great quick book about the invasion, but a landmark year for the Mongol expansion was in 1206. This is when the first real Kurultai, or assembly, was held of all the Mongols' people, and a man by the name of Temujin, who would later be called Genghis Khan, was recognized as supreme leader of the Mongols and granted the title of Genghis, or meaning the illustrious Khan. His plan was the conquest of the world, and he then moved through China, picking up the idea of siege engines and other great Chinese inventions that nobody in the West had ever heard of before. And then he begins moving west and begins taking over key segments of the Silk Road. Interestingly enough, before he moved up into Russia, he moved west into the Khwarezm Empire, the Islamic empire in Persia, and he sent an ambassador to Shah Muhammad, saying, hey, we're coming, we want to see what you're about, etc., etc. The Shah Muhammad thought that the ambassador sent by them by Genghis was a spy, so he cuts off his head. He then sent the head back to Genghis, and so Genghis then went with 200,000 men, hunted the Shah down, killed him and all of his descendants, and ends the Khwarezm dynasty, which ends the Muslim empires in Persia for the time period. And this was a major step in the Mongols moving west. Had this not occurred, people argue that Genghis would have never gone into Eastern Europe, but rather would have moved up even with more power up into Russia and would have created a huge Mongolian empire that would have covered what we would consider to be Russia, Mongolia, Central Asia, into Iran and China today. But since that occurred, Genghis Khan moved west earlier than he would have wanted to. Now, Genghis Khan is important to the history of the Russian Far East, but what's more important to us is kind of post Genghis Khan, and a man by the name, and his grandson by the name of Batu, who creates the Khanate of the Golden Horde, or Kipchak. This is 8 years after, in 1235, after Genghis Khan's death. The Mongols made a huge decision, and they had a two-pronged attack with Kublai Khan, uh, Genghis's one of his grandsons, going south into China this way, and Batu, who was going to head into Europe, and he was going to come this way. Batu's chief of staff was a man by the name of Subatoy, who was in his 60s, but he was an excellent general. And so, with a large army, they moved almost 3,000 miles into northeastern Russian principalities in the taiga, and by 1238, um, they had control of what we would consider to be called Moscow. Novgorod is down here, and other principalities along the Volga River. There they stayed and waited for the thaw, unlike their future successors, Napoleon and Hitler. And in this decision, they actually saved their army in 1238 from disaster. So they waited through 1238 until the thaw, and they waited through 1239. And in the autumn of 1240, Batu sends his ambassadors to Kiev, which would consider to be the center of Kievan Rus at this time period. And he waited for them to answer back, but they were thrown over the side of the wall. And so the next series of events could be easily anticipated. In December of 1240, he waits for everything to freeze so they can move quickly. Batu invades Kiev, and he virtually destroys the city, massacring a bulk of the inhabitants. And it was such a devastating blow that 2 years later, visitors would come to the area and comment that it was still basically what used to be this large center of Kievan Rus was basically a ghost town. And there were comments on the quantity of skulls and bones that littered the countryside. Still, 2 years later, he then went and burned down Krakow, which is over in this vicinity over here, which we would consider to be Poland today. And then he met a German and Polish army in Liegnitz right here and absolutely dominated them. And he went all the way into the Balkans, which you can see in here, which we call the Balkans today, which all the way down into Macedonia, Serbia, and things like that along the Danube River. And he was only called back because the great Khan Ogadai, his uncle, Genghis's brother, died. And so when great Khans died, all of the other Khans were called back, and then they had a decision to make as who would become the next great Khan. Had this not happened, people argue that Europe would have probably been put under Batu's thumb, but since he was called back, that kind of saved Western Europe from Mongol destruction. Europe at this time was defenseless, and it's quite probable that Ogadai's death kept Western Europe alive and the Holy Roman Empire alive to pick up the pieces of the Dark Ages. On his way back to pick a successor, Batu stops in the lower Volga and creates Sarai right here, which will become his capital. And this is where he'll launch more invasions after, and it will become the capital of the next 250 years for what will be called the Khanate of the Golden Horde. And the reason why they're called the Golden Horde is because their tents shone in the sun and it looked like golden waves of wheat because their tents were so huge and there were so many of them. So from a long distance, you would look out and you would see these tents of gold and they would be shining in the sun. The Golden Horde would later be known in Russian history as the time of the Mongol or the Tatar yoke, meaning that by the 1240s, most of what we consider to be Kievan Russia was under the thumb of the Mongols, and they had to pay tribute to the Mongols, and they had to follow the Mongols' laws, and they were basically occupied by them. Hence the yoke. They were yoked like an oxen. And so by the year 1280, as you can see, the Mongol Empire comprised four segments. To the east lay the vast domains of Kublai, and this was known as the Great Khanate, or the Khanate of the Great Khan. And this included Yan China all the way into Vietnam. And Southwest Asia was Hulagu's Ilkhanate, which was Persia, and Eastern Europe and Western Asia. In Eastern Europe and Western Asia, Batu and his descendants were the ruling Kipchak Khanate, or also called the Golden Horde. And fourthly, the major portion of the empire that Genghis took for his descendants was Chaghatay's Khanate right here in the middle. So this, you can see the vast amount of land that the Golden Horde had under its thumb for 250 years and so on. Although it was subjugation in many ways, the Mongol yoke was being felt from the Mediterranean to the Pacific to the Dnieper River. It was the first and only time in history that a single political authority ruled the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Russians. And although, like I said, it was subjugation, if you followed their rules and paid tribute to them, they did not force religious conversion. They let you be whatever religion you were. They did not kill just to kill. They only killed people who pushed them or who did not listen to them. And so during this time period, especially when Batu, Kublai, and Hulagu were still alive, the Pope and kings of Europe would send emissaries there seeking their favors and their trade. And what the people in the West really wanted that the Mongolians had was gunpowder, the rudder post, all of these Chinese inventions, the navigational use of the lodestone, the compass, and other inventions. And so what this really would lead to is what is called the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongolian peace. What ends up happening is through subjugation and empire and good and astute political rule, the Mongolians basically pacified all of these countries and all of this area, and creating a peace, Mongolian peace, or Pax Mongolica. So there's very little fighting for the next 100, 200 years, because they have so much power and there's so much threat of reprisal that nobody even really rebelled against them. It's kind of like there's also a Pax Romana earlier. The Romans were so powerful that nobody even thought about really challenging them. And so that's what Pax Mongolica is the Mongolian peace that will last for 200, 250 years, because nobody had the power to usurp them or even try to overthrow them. We will go through the effects of the Golden Horde in the book that were on the Russian people. But what does happen is that the city of Novgorod was blessed with a wise member of the Rurikid house, meaning people whose ancestors were from Rurik, in the critical years of the middle 13th century by the name of Alexander. He's the first Alexander. He becomes the prince in 1223. The Mongols allowed them to become princes. They allowed them to kind of run business as usual as long as they paid tribute and followed their rules. He actually keeps the Swedes from invading in 1240, and he becomes known as Alexander Nevsky because the fight was on the Nevsky River. And what Alexander does is he convinces most of the people in Kievan Rus that the only way to appease the Mongols and make sure that they don't completely take over and kill everyone was to submit to them. And so he's kind of the beginning of the Kievan Rus princes who say, okay, we cannot fight these people, let's live beside them. And that is what happens for the next 250 years. He is the great prince, and it was his grandson, Ivan I, who is known as Kalita, or Moneybags, that would leave a deep imprint on what the embryonic state of Muscovy. Ivan I and Alexander are really these guys who begin to show that there is a type of Muscovy culture that's flooding out of Novgorod and Moscow that is different from Kiev and is obviously different from the Mongols. Um, he was a pawn and was subjugated to the Great Khan in Sarai. In fact, he also became the Khan's tribute collector, which gave him a strong arm to yield over other Russians. Basically, he was a tax collector. And as with other tax collectors in the history of the world, he became rich with his percentage of taxes while being able to call in the Mongol troops if people in the Russian principalities did not do what Ivan I wanted. He also persuaded the metropolitan, or the chief religious figure of the Orthodox Church in Kiev, to move to Moscow. And so the center of the Orthodox Church at this time period, very important in the early 1300s, moves from Kiev, which is now Ukraine, to Moscow. And this is when Moscow becomes what is known as the Third Rome. Okay, and this is what really turns Moscow into kind of a town on a river, into the center of the Russian principalities. Um, what also helps at the end of the 1300s, the Russian principalities, is that Tamerlane moves through the Khanate of the Golden Horde, up through the Ural River in this vicinity right here, and on the other side of the Ural Mountains. And Tamerlane in this vicinity really does a lot of damage to the Mongol Empire at this time period. And so 4 years later, after 1391, he does it again. So Tamerlane just kind of comes, he takes what he wants, and then he comes back. Then he comes and he takes what he wants, and then he comes back. And so he is one of the beginning of the end of the Golden Horde and the Mongol Empire in Western Russia. And so by 1462, the throne of Moscow was encumbered by a man known as Ivan III. Even though he's known as the Great, he was not a great warrior and he was not a charismatic leader, but he was smart, and he kept those close to him, and his enemies close to him, and he reigned for 43 years. He would later become known as the Gatherer of Russia. Not only during this time period did he build the Kremlin, which is red because his wife was from Byzantium, and that's why the Kremlin in a lot of Moscow has that eastern onion-domed Mediterranean Byzantine look to it. He also presided over the time period when Moscow really becomes what is called the Third Rome, meaning that the first Rome was in Rome, the center of the Christian world. That moved to Byzantium. And then in the late 1400s, the Muslims take over Constantinople from the Orthodox Christians and begin the Ottoman Empire. And so the center of all Christianity in Europe moved from Byzantium into Moscow, and Moscow becomes the Third Rome. And this is when he begins, the leader of the Russian principalities, the Great Prince, begins to be called Tsar, which is a Russian form of Caesar, right? But most importantly, in 1480, while Ivan III's ruling, the Khan Ahmad, of the Golden Horde, who's hanging out in Sarai, could not assert his supremacy over Ivan III. And by the end of the 15th century, after 240 years of subjugation, the uncontested sovereignty of the Russian principalities was exercised from Moscow, right here, instead of Sarai, down here. And the Khanate of the Golden Horde kind of dissipates into nothing. By this time period, Moscow was a major power in Eastern Europe. It was strongly centralized, it was organized, and they were able to make resolute decisions and then send those decisions out. There was also a heightened sense of purpose that was inherited from the Byzantines. And so Moscow finally thinks of themselves as a bastion of Christianity. And so when the Khanate of the Golden Horde kind of dissipates into nothing, and Moscow becomes the center of of what we consider to be Russia today. Their first look after the Mongols leave is actually not to the west, but it is to the east. Then it was Ivan IV from, who creates this idea of Drang nach Osten, meaning a yearning for the east. He's usually known as the Terrible or the Dread. He was the grandson of Ivan III, and he was only 3 years old when he ascended the throne in 1533. Obviously, a regency needed to be set up because you can't run an empire when you're 3 years old. And he grew up in a court that had intrigue, murder, execution, tortures, and so on. So these are the things that he grew up around. He was very well read. He understood military, and he was taught the importance of the military early on. And so when he comes of age, when he's 19, of particular importance are his military undertakings that were launched in 1552, when he defeats the Kazan Tatars right here in the Khanate of Kazan. Here, this is his first real, what you would call it, cutting of the teeth for him, and he is shown to be a adept leader. And his capture of the capital gave them not only did it show that he was a good leader, but this also gives them a great access to water in the middle Ural Mountains, right? The Volga River down to the Caspian Sea, the Don River, and so on and so forth. And it also helps him get to Persia. And so he can trade with all of these people here. And so Russia begins to expand quickly under Ivan IV. But there were two factors that moved Ivan's ideas of heading south and west instead to head east. And both were predicated on the idea that the British and the Dutch were already in the Russian Far East at this time period. And firstly, it was the demand for furs. Like we talked about, it was occasioned by the new trade of furs, and the best furs in the world were found in Russia because of the long winters. And what little the Muscovites knew of the land east of the Urals, even though the Urals can maybe not be considered mountains, but rather very large hills, people west of there did not really know much about what was east of there, except that there were some huge mammals there, and the furs were very expensive, and you could make money off of them. Sound familiar? The second factor was the Wests, as in like British, the Dutch, the Spanish at this time period, their unquenchable thirst to find a northern route to the east through the Arctic. This is the reason why we have Vitus Bering, we have Cook, we have all of these people trying to get through the Bering Strait and through the Arctic Ocean, because they know that the Earth is round by this time. They want to find an easier way to the east as opposed to going all the way around Africa. But because Ivan was being challenged by the West, he looks to a family who lives east of the Ural Mountains who is very powerful by the name of the Stroganov family. And they increasingly bore the brunt of the movement east. They made their money on salt and real estate, and because they were in the eastern part of Muscovy and on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains, they began to send traders over the mountains and knew early on of the furs that could be had, as well as the iron ore, and they also found a lot of fields that could grow wheat, and wheat is a very important for sustenance during this time period, as it is today. So in 1557, they send one of the sons, Anarchy Stroganov, to approach the Tsar with a request for exploitation rights, and Ivan gives them 5 million acres east of the Urals by decree in 1558, and by 1568 they had another 5 million. So basically the Tsar is giving them land that he does not have, but he's giving it to them anyway, and they go and they exploit it. Does that also sound familiar? This is the typical imperial thing. By taking and felling native lands for their natural resources without asking and through force. Um, and most of this work at this time period early on was for the salt mines, but they were also robbing the indigenous of their hunting grounds. And although the Stroganovs, in contrast to most of the ways that indigenous peoples' land was taken from them during this time period by all other Europeans throughout the world, they were fairly fair in dealing with the indigenous, because they actually, in most cases, paid for their land, and did not kill them on site and so on. And so they were businessmen, but they also took what they wanted with the backing of the Tsar and his soldiers. And so the indigenous periodically raided their large holdings and their installations throughout um, the eastern part of the Urals. And you can see the Ural Mountains are right here. So we're talking about this vicinity in this area right here. This is very important for the Stroganov family. So they were in need of help to pacify the natives. So Ivan comes up with a perfect amalgamation of entrepreneurship and imperialism. And he calls on the people known as Cossacks. And the Cossacks are an interesting part of Russian history, and they're really a product of two things. They're a product of the harsh conditions for the peasants and serfs in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, who moved south into this vicinity here, trying to get away from all of the harsh treatment here, and they leave their farms and create little areas right here. And once they came down here, they became known as very good horse riders, and so then after that, they are used as soldiers by landowners, to stop other raids of peoples in from this vicinity here, moving up into Moscow. So they become known as very good soldiers, and they basically become mercenaries for landowners. Thus, in that way, they earn freedom as fighters. And they set up what are called stanitsas, or settlements, that grew up along the Don River, the Volga River, and here's what considered to be the Don Cossacks. Here's the Terek River down here. These are the Terek Cossacks. And so they have little settlements throughout this area here, and they become known as great soldiers. So Ivan uses them to pacify the indigenous peoples east of the Ural, and he puts a Cossack at the head of this Cossack army by the name of Yermak Timofeyevich. He is also known as the Conqueror of Siberia. He's usually identified as a Cossack, but what is known is that the Stroganovs gave him 140 men, 540 of which were Cossacks, many of them criminals, and he armed them, gave them food and other equipment. And Yermak was picked because he was a leader of a Cossack group, and they were known for their military discipline. And he impounds that military discipline on his small band of 900 men, who a motley group who wreak havoc on the indigenous peoples of Siberia. And the principal advantage that he had is that he had muskets. But at the same time, the Khan of what is known as Sibir, right here, his name is Kuchum, had mobility and a bit more knowledge of the land. So what ends up happening is kind of this tit-for-tat fighting. The indigenous who are out-armed are more mobile and know the land better. And so what the Russians do is they begin to float down the Togol River right here. This river right here. So they come from here, they float down here, and they meet him in Sibir right here, the capital of Sibir. It's also known as Iskur. They meet him here, and a siege ensued, and by 1582 of October, Yermak realized that he either had to go into the capital and take it or leave. So on October 25th, 1582, he leads an all-out frontal assault on Iskar, and he takes the city. And so this area is pacified, and after that, the Russians move northeast and south of there into what we would consider to be Siberia today. So this is important because the domination of Siberia would begin after this battle, after October 25th, 1582. Yermak became what is known as the satrap, which is a provincial governor in the vein of the Persian Empire. He was, ironically enough, he was given great armor by Ivan and told to rule as he wanted, while the only thing he had to do was pay tribute to Moscow. And so Yermak does. And in a historical twist of fate, which happens so often, Yermak will die in the early autumn of 1585, trying to escape an ambush by the indigenous, and he drowns in the Irtysh River down in here, east of Sibir, his capital, while wearing the armor. So the armor given to him by Ivan for being a great soldier ends up killing him. So one of the many ironies of history. But before he dies, what is important is that he creates two towns outside of Sibir called Tobolsk and Tara along these rivers, and they are created for the fur trade. And for more than 2 centuries, they will be the main stronghold and administrative center of Russian authority in Asia, especially this city called Tobolsk right here. So the subjugation of Siberia begins in the late 1500s, and it's led by a Cossack by the name of Yermak Timofeyevich. Now our last slide of the PowerPoint, for the week, we're going to talk a little bit about the players or the peoples who begin to move east once the opening of Siberia begins. And we're going to start with a people called the Promyshleniki, also translated loosely into worker. It can also be called entrepreneur. And basically these are just men who are seeking fortunes from the furry creatures of the taiga. And they really begin to be the main push east. I don't know if you can see very well. I thought this picture would be better, but here is a Promyshleniki taking tribute from the indigenous peoples, and the tribute that the indigenous peoples give them are fur. And so then they use those fur to trade and make money. And in an unbelievably short period of only 50 years after 1585, they reached the Pacific Ocean some 4,000 miles away. These Promyshleniki are not the elite of society, but they're usually desperate adventurers who would brave any of the conditions in harsh climates to reap the riches of the wild environment. Some were trappers, but the main idea with them is they were better armed. And a lot of these men are criminals or down on their luck people or homeless or jobless, have nothing better but to go east. And so their main way of subjugation was to come in and demand furs from indigenous and enforce compliance of this by taking hostages. I don't know if any of you have had Alaskan history, but these Promyshleniki will also be some of the leading players who come into the Alaska fur trade with the American-Russian company. Following the Promyshleniki, and don't get me wrong, they are intrepid in the sense that they are going to places that nobody in the West even really knows that much about, and they're finding furs and they're bringing them back for a price. So you cannot say that they weren't brave. They may have been stupid, and they in a lot of ways may have been brutal, but they were definitely brave. Following them were serving men, which would be considered representatives of Muscovy, making sure that the Tsar received his fair share of the fur harvest. Basically, they're tax collectors, but they're tax collectors who are armed with the military. What the serving men do is they build ostrogi, or forts, similar to stockades that are built in the American West. And all of these forts are put on confluences and portages, and they're manned by Cossacks and they're manned by regular troops, as well as criminals who could work for their freedom if they proved worthy. So these representatives of the Russian government slowly and methodically move through the region, setting up forts along the Ob, the Tak, and the Yenisei rivers. Then in 1605, in Muscovy, you have what is known as the Time of Troubles. And we don't have too much time to talk about this, but basically what happens is there's a chaos of succession, and for the next 8 years, order is not restored. For 8 years, what we would consider to be Western Russia, the Russian principalities, is basically ungoverned. Then in 1613, the fate of Russia was completely changed when the Zemsky Sobor, or the Russian Parliament, voted to choose as czar and autocrat to make sure things didn't like this happen again. So they gave him complete control, kind of what happens in Roman times earlier. They appoint a man by the name of Michael Romanov as the Tsar of Russia. And the Romanov family will lead Russia until 1917, when Nicholas II is killed by the Bolshevik Party. His grandfather was the brother to Anastasia, who was the first wife of Ivan the Terrible. He became an astute leader, and once he got the job of autocrat and czar, building of the forts, especially in the east, because they know that there's riches in the east, but they need some type of governmental control down there, resumes quickly, and the Promyshleniki began pushing east of the Yenisei River, and there they would stay. So they would get all the way to the Yenisei River, and they would stay there because there's a basin there where they had as many furs as they could take. There's water, there's portages, there's ways to trade. They build forts there, and so they kind of hang out there. But pretty soon they hear stories of even further east of the Lena River, which is much further east. That's kind of eastern Siberia. Of even larger animals and more fur from the indigenous. And so the Promyshleniki began moving further east. And in 1630, a major milestone was achieved when an ostrog, a fort, was set up in the town, and it's called Yakutsk. And Yakutsk here will become a major center of trade in the east for the Russian Empire. And it's set up along the southern edge of the Lena River. Now, the trek east, interestingly enough, was confined to the Taiga region, and it's confined there for a couple of reasons. Firstly, those were the animals that were sought after. They lived in that vicinity. They didn't live on the steppe. They didn't live on the tundra. They lived in the forests. The huge, massive forests of eastern Russia and Siberia. Secondly, the rivers, the Lena, the Yenisei, the Ural, all of these rivers are convenient means of transportation during the summer and the winter. Now, when the thaws really occurred and things melted, you kind of were stuck where you were. But once things warmed up and that dried, then you could, and the rivers got smaller, then you could pass them. Then it would rain and snow, and then you would wait for the rivers and the ground to freeze, and then you would move east again, right? And rivers were a main way of this. Thirdly, demographically speaking, the population was dispersed and sparse in the taiga and easily subdued and controlled. So they met the least resistance in the forests. The steppe had Turks and Muslims, which were Mongol inheritors and much less likely to give up. And the tundra was just north, and there's just nothing there. It's cold and it's hard to traverse. So by 1646, the Muscovite state had asserted control over virtually all of Asia north of the steppe regions. But it was a slender and overextended rule. The many and various tribes had been coerced into recognizing overlordship, and this was done by force with modern weapons, right? And it was done by hostage taking, and it was done by kidnapping. It was done by force. And much like we have seen in other parts of exploration during this time period, it was not merely just conquest, but it was conquest for profit. Right. And after that, then is when the missionaries will come in and so on and so forth. So this is a little different than the Spanish conquest of the Americas, because that was for God, gold, and glory. This was for gold and glory, but mostly gold, right? Natural resources. And this will be a huge idea of the Russian Far East throughout our whole course. The idea that there are vast amounts of natural resources in this area where very few people live. So, with that, there was governmental influence in all of it. And so next week we will discuss the beginning of the push even further east and south into what we would consider to be China today, and their contact there and how that goes. So that was your first week's PowerPoint. Please let me know if you have any questions. You will be able to use this as well as your YouTube to answer all of the questions on the assignments, but please let me know if you have any questions. One last thing I'd like to say before we end is just kind of an overview of what we talked about. We talked about the geography, we talked about the landscape, the climates, and then we talked about Mongol rule and how that how it affected the Russians, but you'll definitely read much more about that in your book and write about that. We discussed kind of how the idea of the Vikings and how they came in and created these principalities that would eventually lead to men like Yaroslav the Wise, Ivan the First through Ivan the Fourth, to kind of create their own Russian, Slavic, Orthodox Christian culture that is different to the Mongolians, who were their overseers for 250 years. And then once the Mongols leave, interestingly enough, instead of looking to the west, Ivan the Terrible, or the Dread, sometimes called Ivan the Great, moved east, and that is when the beginning of the subjugation of Siberia began. And it was helped by Cossacks, and it was helped by men by the name of Promushleniki. So that's kind of how we end this week, in a quick precursor and history of some of the reasons why the Russian Far East will become so important to not only the Russian Empire, but the Soviet Empire.